I am also, my specific focus in psychology, that's what I study at school, is positive psychology, because I like to specifically, I don't like to really like focus on like diagnosis or like what's wrong with a person, but how can we become happy? And then ethnogens, transpersonal psychology, which is the kind of the intermixing of spirituality within psychology, which I think is kind of, you know, something that we desperately lack within westernized medicine and psychology. But yeah, so should I go ahead and share my screen, get started with the presentation?
Shoot.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, share. Okay, cool. Gotta get it all set up here. Okay. All right, cool. So welcome everybody. This is my presentation on microdosing. So a quick note before we start, this presentation will include both anecdotal reports as well as scientific reports and information. This is due to a lack of scientific studies around microdosing, and I shall do my best to indicate which is which, although they do tend to inform one another. As we go along, I shall be providing links to my sources, some of which are anecdotal, usually from online forums and other such websites, as well as links to the free versions of the scientific articles. I use an online tool called Sci-Hub to access these articles for free, as I believe that information should be freely available to all. So I'm going to go ahead and link that in the chat right now. Okay, so let's start with a general overview. On a basic level, what is microdosing? So microdosing can look a little different for everyone, but in general, microdosing can be described as taking a low enough dose of a psychedelic that it doesn't affect or impair the normal day-to-day functioning of an individual. That is, if you start to feel it more than a very slight amount, or even at all, you may have gone too far. Keep in mind that brain and body chemistry can make everyone react a little differently, meaning that a microdose for your friends might be the tipping point into tripping for you. So when you are first starting out, try and take your dose on a day off instead of right before work, just in case. On a more official level, a microdose can be defined as approximately 1/10 to 1/20 of a recreational dose, but once again, that varies per substance and per individual. It's important to note that scientific research on microdosing is pretty lacking, and so there are relatively loose general consensuses in the scientific world about what microdosing is, or whether or not the claims that most make when microdosing, discussing microdosing are true on a scientific basis. But one thing is for sure is that many speak highly of their experiences on a microdosing schedule, which leads to the next point. For most, microdosing also means having a microdosing schedule. Different people recommend different schedules for different substances, but in general, it will look like a few days on, a day or two off, and then an extra day or two on, repeated forever how long is necessary. I will specify more later on in the presentation using Paul Stamets and Jen Fadiman's recommendations for schedules as examples. Some also recommend supplementing your microdosing with other helpful techniques such as meditation and yoga in order to work with and get the most out of the cognitive changes occurring within the brain. So why do people microdose? Precisely because of the cognitive changes that occur when on a regimen. People report improved overall well-being as well as enhanced cognition and improved emotional processes, both of which help improve well-being. Many also report it to be very helpful for enhancing creativity, although that goes along with enhanced cognitive flexibility. This is why you hear about microdosing in Silicon Valley. Thanks Steve Jobs, he microdosed. Some other basic general well-being changes that have been reported anecdotally as well as through studies are the lowering of anxiety and depression, as well as being helpful for the treatment of addiction, boost in physical energy levels, and the promotion of emotional balance. These are subtle but noticeable effects. They will be more noticeable when microdosing is conducted in a mindfully aware manner, which is something I will touch on when we talk about finding a microdose schedule that works for you well. But for now, just know that mindfulness is highly recommended in the microdoses journey. So going into deeper specifics and drawing upon the limited source of studies, study number 1 was conducted by, oh, there's some clicking. Hold on, I'm going to take my earring out. So study number 1 conducted by Thomas Anderson in 2019. I'm going to link that right now. So this study, as I said, conducted by Thomas Anderson, is claiming to be the first to investigate microdosing psychedelics and its effects on mental health. And it was found that microdosing is associated with lower dysfunctional attitudes and negative emotionality, as well as showing rates of higher wisdom, open-mindedness, and creativity. So study number 2, conducted by James Fadiman and Sophie Korb in 2019, conducted a worldwide open enrollment exploratory study into people's experience with microdosing. It was found that people's experiences were mostly positive. Oh wait, let me link that one real quick. Okay, there's that one. People's experiences were mostly positive or positive leaning neutral experiences at 80%. And the rest were negative or negative leaning neutral experiences, but those were only about 20% of the time. In general, there was an overall increase in positive emotions and a decrease in negative emotions. Those that had positive experiences reported an easier time in social interactions, more patience with others, less headaches, more energy when it comes to work, as well as increases in creativity. Those with neutral experiences typically reported that they weren't sure if microdosing had helped them or not, usually describing some type of nervous energy. Those with negative experiences reported higher anxiety and uncomfortable physical symptoms, usually with mushrooms. But the most common themes in the microdosing self-reports they received for the study include mood changes, change in work, change in home life, and help with the depression that comes along with chronic pain. Although microdosing was not helped as shown with pain in the majority of people, there may be evidence here for help with neuropathic pain, such as with shingles, although more studies must be conducted to come to any conclusions. So this study number 3 by Thomas Anderson, again in 2019, which we shall be looking at more when we get to the risks involved in microdosing. But this study found that there were significant improved behaviors related to anxiety, eating, exercise, meditation, mood, and sleep. And there were significant reductions in the use of alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, psychiatric drugs, tobacco, and other illicit drugs not specified. So what substances do people microdose with and at what kind of doses? And just so you guys are aware, there will be photos of said substances. So psilocybin is an obvious one. People usually report a microdose to be under 1 milligram. So psilocybin can be a tricky one to dose properly because there are many different strains and each strain has different amounts of psilocybin contained within. Not only that, but there are several factors that will produce changes in potency among batches of mushrooms. These factors include when the mushrooms were harvested in their growth, the soil quality, where it was grown, how they were dried, and how they were grown. So one of the best ways to assure that you are getting the amount of psilocybin that you desire is to start growing mushrooms yourself and put the time and research into how to do so properly. Psilocybin spores are available legally online, and there are many informational sources to draw from. Just take the necessary precautions to avoid legal trouble once they're grown. A recommended starting dose could be 0.01 milligram or 0.02 milligram, but these are mere suggestions. It is up to you to find what works best. Remember just to start slow and go from there. Next one up is LSD. People usually report a microdose between 10 and 25 micrograms. Although depending on the person, 25 micrograms might produce noticeable effects. That may not be what you're going for. But just as with psilocybin, don't forget that it's important to know the exact potency of the drug that you are consuming. As an example, let's say you use one tab up in a week or two and then move on to your next tab, which you received from a different source from the first one. That second tab might be stronger or weaker than the week's previous tab. Street market tabs can range anywhere from 50 micrograms to 200 micrograms. And so it can be easy to accidentally dose yourself too high. It's a good idea to try and find a source that will tell you exactly what microgram your tabs are sitting at. Although a good way around this might to try and get your hands on liquid LSD instead. She'll be talking more about that in a bit. Always make sure that you're testing all of your drugs. LSD in particular, in my eyes, is one that is very important to test. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but if it's bitter, it's a spitter. This phrase comes from the wide prevalence of research chemicals masquerading as LSD. Due to the illegality of LSD, certain substance manufacturers try to get around this by creating substances that are very close to the chemical structure of LSD, but aren't quite the same. Some of those are fine to take and even frequently sought out, but they are not LSD and cannot be treated as such. and a significant portion of them can have some nasty effects mentally and physically and shouldn't be microdosed or even taken at all, definitely not on a regular basis, especially since we don't know yet the long-term effects of doing so due to their freshness on the market. New RCs are being developed all the time due to the DEA attempting to catch up with the market to make them all illegal. I shall add in the chat a couple of good sources for reading about and procuring your own acid test kit. Post those right now. Nope. Okay, so there's another good point to make here. If you're dealing with liquid LSD, it's important to be very cautious. Accidentally getting even a drop on your skin can launch you into a heavy trip, depending on how much was in that drop. And as we know, LSD is quite potent. Of course, there's always the risk of spilling even more than a drop, which might lead to a dose even beyond a heroic dose. So just be careful. And as I'm sure most of us know, keep your LSD out of light, heat, and even sealed away from oxygen if you can. Most just stick their tabs in the freezer in a small piece of tinfoil. This will keep your potency at the same or similar levels for longer periods of time, which is most important when you are trying to follow a microdosing regimen. So a couple other substances that people commonly microdose with are Ibogaine and DMT, although I'm admittedly much less familiar with those substances in general, and especially for the purposes of microdosing. But for the purposes of this presentation, I think it's important to at least point out that people do indeed microdose with them, and at which doses people tend to microdose with them at. So Ibogaine usually around 200 milligrams and DMT around 6. But I'm going to post a couple links in the chat to both a microdosing guide to Ibogaine as well as DMT. This is the link for the Ibogaine, and then this is the link to the DMT. Okay, so anyone who's interested in learning more can start there. So how to create a microdosing schedule that works for you. 3 general common approaches that have been recommended are, number 1, the Fadiman approach, who you see on the slide. And it looks like 2 days on and 2 days off. There's the weekday approach, which is pretty self-explanatory. Monday and Friday is the dosing days, and then Saturday and Sunday are days off. Or the balanced approach, which is every other day. There's also the approach that Paul Stamets takes. For anyone who is not aware yet, Paul Stamets is a very well-renowned mycologist who is focused on all types of mushrooms, not just hallucinogenic. He generally recommends the weekday approach, and he also recommends his stacking method, in which you microdose mushrooms alongside with doses of both, I always have a hard time pronouncing these, aranicines / pyrosinones. I think that's it. Always really have a hard time pronouncing those, but they're found within the lion's mane mushroom, which you can also see there on the slide, and also niacin. And it has been suggested that niacin helps get substances past the blood-brain barrier, as well as allowing psilocybin to reach the nerve endings that psilocybin alone would not be able to reach. I found that absolutely fascinating. I had no idea about that. This information is coming from a clinical trial in which 29 patients with anxiety and depression related to their cancer were given psilocybin therapy in conjunction with niacin. It was shown that after 6 months, 60 to 80% of the patients had significantly lower anxiety and depression levels. So the stack that Paul recommends looks like this, and you can see on the screen. So psilocybin, it says 1 to 10 milligrams, but that's based on body weight and not the weight of the mushrooms themselves. I will link sources after this slide to follow his method more precisely. And then the molecules derived from the lion's mane that I have a hard time pronouncing. He recommends 50 to 200 milligrams, but once again, that's based on body weight. And then niacin at 100 to 200 milligrams. So let me post those links. Because there's like specific math that you have to do in order to figure out like what is the absolute best microdose for you, and personal experimentation. So another note is that people might follow a regimen anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of years. It can vary wildly from person to person and case to case. Many also do not follow a specific regimen, or they create regimens of their own. Just depends on what works best for you and what you're trying to achieve. It's important to notice and keep track of the cognitive changes in order to bolster their effects and understand what a microdosing schedule and dose looks like for you. I personally recommend keeping a journal. as it is a good way to understand what is coming up for you, and so you can reference what you want to work on at any point. I want to stress the importance of being mindful and not just relying on psychedelics to do the work for you. They will lead you to the path, but you must take the action and walk the path. So this is from a Reddit user that I was reading on the microdosing subreddit about on schedule that I personally found insightful. So schedule is one of those mystical things that we turn to idols, Stamets, etc., to guide us in microdosing. It's a great place to start for comfort and consistency, but I wonder how many people choose to finally go their own way and adapt their own schedule. Akin to pharmaceuticals, it isn't the same dose and schedule for SSRIs or other long-term medications for everyone. I think this perfectly captures the idea of intuitively figuring out the best schedule for you by being mindfully aware of the changes within you. Meditation and yoga practices in concurrence with your microdosing schedule can help you keep you mindfully aware, as well as adding to the psychological and spiritual benefit of microdosing. So finding what works for you, personal experimentation. If you have never done the substance that you want to try and microdose, it has been suggested by Microzoomers, the page of which I will link right now, that it might be helpful, at least in the case of mushrooms, to start with a creative dose, first on a day off, which they define around 0.5 to 1 gram, just so you can get a feel for how mushrooms affect you. I thought this was interesting and helpful, so I wanted to add it in case others found it useful as well. But assuming you have already had experience with them or the other substances that you were interested in microdosing, my advice, once again, is to just take it slow, be mindful about your doses and how they're affecting you, and this is where a journal comes in handy as well. It's good to, mark which doses you're doing and which seem to work the best for you. There's a great number of factors that can change how microdosing affects you. I got these factors from Aaron Eisen's presentation here at PPS because he is more aware of the neuropharmacology around microdosing than I am, so shout out to him as always. But the factors include, but are not limited to, the potency of the psychedelic, diet, which depends on the psychedelic, weight, height, genetics, liver enzymes, specifically cytochrome P450, mental health status, personality type, and natural tolerances. So why take days off? Tolerance. It's important to give your brain and body chemistry a chance to reset. If you take your microdoses too often, your acquired tolerance to them will slowly increase until you don't feel the dose anymore. By taking days off, you are resetting the effectiveness of the dose. It's important to note that everyone has a unique individual baseline tolerance, which is what we call your natural tolerance. The same factors that I mentioned in the previous slide are at play here as well. Diet, weight, height, and whether the administration of the drug is oral. So the tolerance of oral drugs tend to be more contingent on these factors than other forms of administration, among other factors. If people are interested in learning more about the specific neurological basis for tolerances, both natural and acquired, I direct you to Aaron Eisen's presentation, How to Microdosing, and I'm going to put that in chat. Something else I will add from this presentation is the tryptamine redosing calculator, which I shall link now. So this calculator can help you determine how much you will need to take of either mushrooms or LSD, depending on your last dose, as well as how many days it has been since you last consumed the substance. Aaron notes that the result from the calculator can be pretty rough and should be taken with a grain of salt. He does not necessarily condone its use. Taking those days off also gives you time to integrate what you have learned from the psychedelic experience. Meditate on any changes that have occurred and remind yourself what you would like to work on. Looking at your journal is a helpful way to do so as well. So are there risks involved in microdosing? Short answer, just as with anything you consume that creates changes on a neurological level, is yes. We've already discussed some of these risks, such as accidentally taking over a microdose, which is, I don't know if that's actually a risk or not, depending on what you're doing that day, but there are specific challenges that may occur in conjunction with the benefits of microdosing. According to the study, which I've already linked, but I am going to link again, these risks and benefits seem to mirror each other and include changes in mood. So as you can see on the chart, so mood, improved mood versus impaired, self-efficacy versus self-interference, focus, improved focus versus impaired, social benefits versus social interference, energy levels improved or impaired, cognitive benefits, cognitive impairments, anxiety, so reduced or increased anxiety, and then physiological changes, so physiological enhancement or discomfort, among others. Most common benefits include improved mood, focus, energy, and creativity. And interestingly enough, it was found that of the challenges, physiological discomfort and concerns of illegality were among the top contenders. In general, however, more beneficial experiences with microdosing were reported than negative or challenging experiences. So other potential risks, this is from Stamets' website on the topic of microdosing mushrooms. We specifically do not recommend that people with color blindness who live with diagnoses of psychotic disorders or along the autism spectrum try microdosing. People with color blindness report lasting visual distortions from microdosing. Literature suggests people with psychotic disorders may be harmed by psychedelics, and in our experience, people with diagnoses along the autism spectrum seem to require dosages that far exceed what is traditionally considered microdosing. So I will also add a little bit about my own personal experience with it. But just to sum it up nicely, microdosing helps keep me loose and open-minded. I learn things very quickly, and I can make phenomenal growth as a person on a monthly basis. In conjunction with other mindfulness techniques such as yoga and meditation, I'm always talking about those, microdosing helps me be honest with myself and see clearly where certain thoughts or ideas are coming from. I've already been working on and being in the habit of therapizing myself, and microdosing accelerates that experience. So other interesting information, Paul Stamets has announced the first ever mobile microdosing study, which you can participate in through your phone. And I will add links for anyone who is interested in learning more and possibly participating in the study. But unfortunately, and this really sucks for me as a Samsung user, it's only currently available for iPhone and Apple Store users. But if you have an iPhone, then you can participate if you want to. So some important parting notes, conclusions, and reminders. First and foremost, microdosing can be a safe and very effective way to treat the day-to-day struggles of the average person, as well as being possibly quite an effective treatment for long-term depression, anxiety, and addiction. Sticking to a good regimen can help balance the emotional states and boost energy levels, as well as fostering creativity within the mind. Due to the nature of variance between brains and bodies, everyone's microdosing schedules and dosages are going to be unique. Keep this in mind when introducing the idea of microdosing to your friends and loved ones. What works for you will not necessarily work for them or be what they need. It's also, as always, important to keep in mind that not everyone should try microdosing or psychedelics in general. Stay informed and stay safe. Don't use my presentation as a complete guide to microdosing. Always use your own research and try and put a fair amount of time and work into understanding what microdose can look for you in terms of dose, substance, etc. This is your own personal responsibility, user beware. This is especially true for those who are looking to replace their current treatments with a microdosing protocol. Research, research, research. Look at multiple websites and use careful judgment when researching. And don't forget to start off with as small of a dose as you can and then go from there. Perhaps wait until you have a day off to start, just in case you accidentally start tripping but have to go into work later and aren't comfortable with doing that. For mushrooms, a decent scale set to 2 decimal points is extremely helpful. Try not to just eyeball it. For other substances, a powder scale that is a highly sensitive scale might be more expensive but very useful. Determine if you can trust the source of your substance. The best way to do this with mushrooms is to grow your own and through testing with other substances such as LSD. And I'm aware I have emphasized the importance of understanding certain risks when it comes to this practice, but don't fret too much. Both research and anecdotal experience has pointed to the deep usefulness of microdosing on many levels. If you already benefit from macrodoses, it is likely that you would benefit from a microdosing regimen as well, for those curious about starting one. So some more resources, as already mentioned. Arrowhead, we got YouTube. Psych Substances is a great channel to start out with. You got shroomery.org, which is an online shroom forum. The Third Wave, which I highly, highly, highly recommend looking at. I'm actually going to post another link to them. And they are an organization dedicated specifically to researching, collecting, and spreading information about microdosing. They do a great job. We got maps.org, which is always just a good resource for the psychedelic world in general. And then even the microdosing subreddit. So reddit.com/rmicrodosing. I'm also going to put that in the chat. There's a lot of really, really interesting conversations and rhetoric that happens there. And then also, of course, Aaron Eisen's microdosing presentation. But not only that, but Casey, one of the wonderful hosts of tonight's event, has a microdosing one-on-one workshop. And here's the link for that as well. So I would also like to close out with some interesting topics that I did not have the time to get into, but were considerations that I would like to dive into at some point. I'm going to add them here in case anyone wants to discuss these particular ideas, but basically, what would the benefits be of taking larger doses intermittently with microdosing and vice versa, or any specific differences in benefits or risks between different substances. So the differences between LSD and psilocybin, or the differences between Ibogaine and DMT. So yeah, that was it. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Let me stop sharing the screen. Okay.